Is it worth playing a meta spec? What benefits would you have for choosing to play an augmentation? What are you losing if you don't pick something everyone wants you to play, like a Havoc Demon Hunter? How deep into the meta with your spec choice should you go? Let's answer those questions right now. Off the bat, is it worth it to play a meta spec? Yes, it is. By the sheer definition of what meta is. What meta is, essentially, is the ability to clear content in the most efficient way possible in the scope of World of Warcraft, of course, because meta exists outside of World of Warcraft, but we live in the Matrix, so we don't talk about that stuff. In terms of World of Warcraft, meta essentially is something that has been more and more prevalent ever since Mythic Plus has become a thing, because we can compare it all day long. Mythic Plus is a much more competitive PvE content than raiding is, since it scales indefinitely and performance starts to be more and more important and more focused on. That, of course, created other issues like discrimination towards certain people playing certain specs where they cannot get into, let's say, certain keys or certain raids. That's not necessarily because that spec is not able to clear the content or is significantly weaker, but because people just want to make sure that they do the best of their ability to increase the chances of them clearing the content. The best way to make sure that you guarantee a boss dies or a dungeon gets cleared in time is to invite specs that you know for sure can do a lot of damage, a lot of healing, or survive a lot, because let's not beat around the bush here. Meta specs, or how we used to call them back in the day, flavor of the month specs, do a lot of heavy lifting for a lack of player skill, which is not necessarily something new. It pretty much applies in all areas, in all things. Is that a bad thing necessarily? Not really. There's always going to be a meta, because in an endlessly competitive content and endlessly scaling content, that 1% difference in damage, healing, survivability starts to get more and more important, and there is always going to be one thing that's better than the other. No, all things are equal, and when one thing is better than the other, then essentially it becomes the best thing, even if it's not just the better thing at the content that you're trying to do. And if you are just, you know, a little outlaw rogue and you want to do your Mythic Plus key, and it's kind of a higher level than what you're used to, and you really want to make sure that you do this in time, who are you going to invite? Those marksmanship hunters or that Havoc Demon Hunter? And when you have a choice between inviting, let's say, a fire mage or a frost mage, who are you going to get? Probably the fire mage. If you have a choice between inviting a holy priest or a Mistweaver monk, you're probably going to go with the Mistweaver monk, and that is just the nature of the beast. Ideally, it would be nice to not be that way, but when you're pushing content, it's likely not going to change anytime soon. And that is probably one of the biggest issues when playing a spec, is if you don't have a group of friends or a guild that was willing to do the content with you, you have to get into groups. And if you are playing solo, I would recommend you play a meta spec. Hopefully one that you also enjoy. Otherwise, just be comfortable with having to wait 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour getting into certain groups to clear a specific Mythic Plus key or a raid, although it's probably easier to get into raid, or likely not get into any at all. That sucks, and that's, once again, probably not going to change anytime soon. But if you do decide to do that, picking up a meta spec is actually kind of fun, and it's significantly rewarding, considering that you do see the feedback of your performance way quicker, since you do just way more damage or more healing. Something like Havoc Demon Hunter probably requires a lot less effort, definitely requires a lot less gear to do the same amount of damage that a Feral Druid might do at that same level of content. By getting into groups easier with stuff like, I don't know, a Vengeance Demon Hunter or a Mistweaver Monk, gets you to do more keys, more raid bosses, gets you to clear more content and become a better player in and of itself. That doesn't mean you cannot play other specs, but when we're talking about pugging, if you have a goal for yourself to do 3k IO or to push higher or to get all 25s, 26s done in time because that is your personal goal, or to get cutting edge and you don't have a group already, then you will significantly increase the chances of being able to join a group or being invited to a group if you do play a meta spec. just as much as you will be able to increase the chances of seeing awesome videos by being a part of our Patreon team. Go to patreon.com/MarcelianOnline if you do decide to support us, or at least want to check what this is all about, because we do have a bunch of goodies for Patreons as well that are not accessible to everybody else. Goodies like customizable wallpapers with your characters in glorious 4K resolution, bloopers from these types of videos where mostly I fuck up on camera, and other cool stuff. Plus, you'll be making sure that we can keep the lights on here at Marcelian Online and having more awesome videos in the future. Thank you for considering it. Link is down in the description, and let's talk more about why it's easier to deal big damage with meta specs like Retribution Paladin. Yes, Red is currently a meta spec, and it is exploding on the meters. It has been doing so, but especially now after the MDA, everybody else can see that Red is really good, and it's very easy to do big damage with as opposed to other specs. Usually meta specs are tuned in a way where obviously they do more damage, sometimes they're tankier, sometimes both, and once they have established themselves to be meta, it's very unlikely that they will be nerfed to a point where they cannot be played anymore. Blizzard doesn't really over-nerf certain overperforming classes because of how the content actually evolves into a season of World of Warcraft, where people already establish their team, they qualify for tournaments, they push different content, they invest time, effort into them playing a specific spec, and having that spec nerfed would be incredibly bad and create incredibly negative tension between the devs and the players. And since, you know, nobody really wants to hate the other side, the devs are unlikely going to nerf any spec that is currently meta. It hasn't happened at all. They might balance it, and that might scare a bunch of people, but if you do decide to pick a meta spec and actually play it, you can at least rest assured that you will be performing above average the entire season, and likely be invited into groups the entire season and not have to worry about feeling left behind the entire season, which is a big plus if you think that other specs kind of have to pray that maybe the next patch notes are about them and they can get themselves a little bit of a buff so that they can do a little bit better. One thing that came up this particular expansion, and more likely this last patch, is the fact that people actually really need survivability. Certain specs can get away with it, especially if you use an augmentation evoker, or if anything, that justifies people playing augmentation evoker in certain content, especially in mythic keys, where augmentation evoker can offer tankiness to specs like Balanced Druid that doesn't really have that much tankiness to begin with. Other specs like Rogue perform exquisitely in high-level content, especially Outlaw, and that's one of the biggest reasons why Outlaw is so good, is because of how easy it is to survive. Considering that all of the defensives that Outlaw has constantly have their cooldown reduced by you just playing your rotation, as opposed to the other Rogue specs like Assassination, makes it so that you have more uptime on your defensives, more tools available when things start to hit very hard, and you can just survive those things. Other classes, once again Red Paladin, are based upon a really good spec design where your defensives are just top tier. Not to mention that besides those defensives, you also have really great utility, which definitely makes Red really good, but also makes Protection Paladin a very desirable tank, at least in Mythic Plus, because of the utility. These are the bloopers that I talked about. But that's what makes Protection Paladin really good in high keys, because of the utility that they can provide to the party, where other tanks like Protection Warrior cannot do that. Protection Warrior might be more tanky than Protection Paladin. I don't know if it does more damage than Protection Paladin, certainly does a very large amount of damage, but you probably won't see very many Protection Warriors clearing the highest of keys, because Paladin comes with an additional sacrifice, Blessing of Protection, Freedom, off heals for your group, which add up to quite a bit over the course of a long key. Similar in raids, if we talk about surviving, Blood Decays can actually solo tank normal and heroic frac, and probably a bunch of other bosses as well, which is something that no other tank can do. For instance, let's talk about heroic frac. A Blood Decay can actually solo tank, freeing up a spot for a DPS, freeing up a spot for the other tank to do other mechanics, like, I don't know, maybe a seed in the last phase, although that's not usually necessary. but it's an example as to why people might want a Blood Decay in a raid. Blood Decay is good pretty much all around because it actually requires close to zero attention from your healers. Outside of an external cooldown here and there to survive a particular mechanic, Blood Decays are fairly self-reliant. Now, they probably won't push as high of a key as Protection Paladin or Vengeance Demon Hunter because of how their design is. But in raid, at the very least, since you don't really need infinite tankiness, you're probably okay and ideally want it over everything else as a Blood Decay. And healing has never been maybe more looked at than it is now in Dragonflight, considering how difficult it is to keep people alive. Hence, a good healer makes a world of a difference. It used to always be the case, but mostly because people wanted damage out of healers. But now, since the damage of healers, even if you do optimize on it, is fairly meh across the board if you're not a resto druid, which is probably why resto druids are maybe one of the most sought after healers at the high end. You still want healers that can actually keep people alive, and usually those are right now Mistweavers in dungeons as well as resto druids, but also Mistweavers in raids, which are probably the healers with the most amount of throughput, meaning HPS, across the board. And that just makes it way easier to do content because, you know, people always fuck up, and this applies to DPS and tanks as well. When you mess up, having a spec that can offset the mistakes with pure brute force numbers does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to performing and progressing through the content. But another thing has become very apparent in Dragonflight, and that is that healer responsibility is very important in making sure that your DPS and your tank do the most amount of damage to clear the content. And I'm talking about handling affixes in Mythic Plus. Of course, that applies to raids. You know, healing all of those adds on Farak definitely makes me feel better as a DPS at just wailing on the boss. But in terms of dungeons, there are so many more affixes, it feels like these days, that need a really good healer to handle them. Incorporeal, for instance. Oh my god, having a priest on an incorporeal week just makes a load of difference. Similar as is to play a priest on a bursting week as well makes it so much better to constantly dispel those bursting. Even with a mass dispel makes pulls that no other healer can handle way better. Having classes like Paladin have freedom for everybody doing Entangling Week just trivializes these affixes and makes it much better and pushes these specs to be better and better and better across the board, eventually becoming meta specs. It feels incredible to be able to know that you have the tools to deal with what the game throws at you, whether those are affixes in dungeons or pure numbers required for you to damage a boss and kill it before your healer runs out of mana. That kind of a feeling is very hard to beat and is definitely very satisfying when you're trying to clear content. You, of course, don't have to play the meta spec to be able to clear decent content, and struggling to perform on an off meta spec definitely adds a different layer of challenge and flavor to the game that you need, and as such you can just play one of the most fun melee DPS specs in the game that we already have a video for that you can click right here on our channel and go watch it and see if you can have fun even if it's not a meta spec.